engage in devotional service, and always meditating upon me, having fixed their minds upon me, O sons of God. For them I am swift deliverer from the ocean of earth. Let's stop there, because we're just going to start with these first seven verses. So what is our goal? Our goal is spiritual loving service for Shaimasundar, the beautiful blackish cowherd boy. This is what we're trying to achieve. And up till now in the Bhagavad Gita, this has been very clearly established, especially in chapter 10, where Krishna is saying, Aham sarvasya prabhavo mata sarvam pravartate iti mat bhavajantigam buddhabhava samanvitaha, and in chapter 7, nataparitam nanya kinchidasti janantaya. So Krishna has established that this is the goal. Yes, and at the end of chapter 9, very famous verse that's twice in the Bhagavad Gita, Man mana bhava mad bhakta So here we're looking at two main paths. Now really you could say there's four paths, but we're looking at two main divisions of paths with Arjuna's question. He's saying, what's a better way to attain to the spiritual loving service to Shaimasundar? Should I start with bhakti, or should I go through a step-by-step process that leads me to bhakti? And again, this is a very important question. We may think, well, what does this question have to do with me? But I see that there are many, many devotees who are confused about this question without necessarily articulating this question in the same way. So many people whose progress is slow or dry or difficult may not be aware that they're actually doing a step-by-step process that leads to bhakti rather than bhakti from the beginning, having thought that that process would be superior for them. So we're going to look at each one separately. First, bhakti from the beginning. So the goal. Now what I did here is I took the verses and purports themselves, the Acharya's commentary on the verses, and also other places where Srila Prabhupada referred to these verses. So here's from a lecture where Srila Prabhupada says, we have dedicated our life to see Krishna, to talk with Krishna, to play with Krishna, to have Krishna as our son, to have Krishna as our friend, to have Krishna as our lover. So, yes, would everybody agree that this is a very clear statement of our goal? Now, by the way, having this as our goal, even if we have presently material desires, means that we are on the path of pure bhakti, which is another very important point to understand. When Rupa Goswami says, Anya bilasita shunyam, don't have any material desires, he doesn't mean that there is no material desires within us, because we couldn't start the process of bhakti from the end. But what it means is what we have as our goal is a state beyond material desires. As opposed to, say, someone who's worshiping God with the goal of having the big fancy house and a lot of money and power. That's their purpose. So we may want a big fancy house with a lot of money and power. It's not that desire is necessarily absent in us, but our goal is what Prabhupada is explaining here. That our goal is that we want to see and talk with Krishna, and we want to revive our original spiritual relationship with him, and simply in love. So what is the process? So in text 2, Krishna says, Maya avesha mano. Fix your mind on me. And this, of course, is a repeated theme. As we mentioned, Manmana Bhava Mad Bhakto. Right? Or in the 7th chapter, Maya Shakta Mano Bhakta. It's just a repeated theme throughout the Gita, and it's a repeated theme throughout all of the scriptures. To take the mind and fix it on Krishna. That is the process. So Rupa Goswami, after giving, he gives all the different processes, 64 processes of bhakti. But what does he says is the most important one? To always remember Krishna and never forget him. And that's the essence of the process, is to always think of Krishna By the way, why is thinking of Krishna so important?
Because sometimes it can appear in dreams, sometimes it can appear it comes from the thought, as it is in everything, or in everything.
Yes, that's so beautifully said. Thank you. Some other thoughts on why thinking of Krishna is so important. Yes.
At the time of death, if we don't think of Krishna, we won't be.
Yes,
going back
that
to
what we
Krishna.
think about at the time of death is pivotal. Yes.
Also, in the Bhagavad Gita, it says at the beginning that Krishna Arjuna says, "Don't give up your occupation, just to think of me."
While you yes, so that there's also a theme in the Gita of keep doing whatever you're doing in the world, but think of me. Yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Because you'll be thinking about yourself. If you're not thinking Krishna, you're going to.
Okay, that's a very important point. That I can't just be void if I'm not thinking about Krishna. Then I'm having essentially self-centered thoughts. Okay, and how? With faith, Shradaya Paraya. So to have transcendental faith. Not just thinking of Krishna, but with transcendental faith. So we see particularly in India and among Indians, although I think it's happening in Western spiritualists as well, that people may think of Krishna as a cartoon character or a mythological character or something like that. You know, one gentleman was recently telling me in Italy that, he thinks Krishna is a living being who has attained enlightenment. You know, that's how he understood Krishna, rather than understanding Krishna as the Supreme Lord. So there's many people who may think about Krishna, but they're not thinking of Krishna in the right mood. So not only to think about him, but with faith, and with faith that is not born of the material nature. And then that was about the mind, then this is about the body. To always be worshipping Shamasunder, Nitya Yukta Upasate. And we say, well, always worshipping Krishna, does this mean I have to be a pujari, and do 5 offerings a day? No, because everything, just like you so nicely pointed out, that everything we do can be a form of worship. Everything. Because Krishna is everywhere and in everything. So how I put my socks on can be a form of worship. How I speak to someone on the street can be a form of worship. Everything can be a form of worship if I understand that Krishna is everywhere. And this is the point, that whatever work we do for Krishna. That whatever we're doing, we're thinking, may Krishna be happy with this. May Krishna be happy with this. May Krishna be happy with this. And again, this applies to everything. It applies to our dealing with all people, with animals, with plants. It applies to our dealing with things. That if we're thinking, may Krishna be pleased with how I'm dealing with this chair. May Krishna be pleased with how I'm dealing with my socks. May Krishna be pleased with how I'm dealing with my child, or with this customer, or whatever. And here in Prabhupada's purport to text 2, we find a statement that at first glance is rather astonishing and difficult to understand. Sometimes he chants, sometimes he hears or reads books about Krishna, or sometimes he cooks prasadam, or goes to the marketplace to purchase something for Krishna, or sometimes he washes the temple or the dishes. Whatever he does not let a single moment pass without devoting his activities to Krishna. Such action is in pure samadhi. So normally when we think of samadhi, do we think of somebody washing dishes in samadhi? No. We have some examples in the Bhagavatam of people in samadhi who are unaware of their surroundings. Can we think of some examples?
Sobari Muni was meditating under the water.
Sobari Muni, yes. Who else was unaware of their surroundings? They didn't hear what was said to them.
Sage meditating when Maharaj Pariksit put the...
Yes, Namakarishi, when Maharaj Pariksit put the dead snake around his neck, and Maharaj Pariksit had said, I'm sure in a very kingly way, "Water! Give me water!" And the sage didn't respond because he was in samadhi. Some other examples? There was Lord Shiva, right? He didn't stand up to honor Daksha because he was in samadhi. Then we have another sage, I think he was called Indrajumna, who didn't hear the yogis coming, and therefore he was cursed to become an elephant. He became Gajendra. So generally, samadhi is the last stage of Ashtanga yoga, and before you get to samadhi, you do pratyahara. Pratyahara is where you withdraw your senses from the external world. And it's compared to a kind of deep sleep where you really don't see or hear or experience anything in the world around you. And that comes quite a bit before samadhi. So how do you go to the marketplace in samadhi? Excuse me, are you in samadhi? Because if you are, we don't want you driving the truck. Or cooking, you know, fire sounds kind of risky. Cut off your finger, set the kitchen on fire. What does this mean, this purport?
Always thinking of Krishna in anything you do.
Yes, always thinking of Krishna in anything you do. Like Prabhupada's saying, devoting the activities to Krishna. But it's a deep thinking about Krishna. Samadhi is very deep. Prabhupada says full samadhi. So I understand this to mean that it's a natural samadhi that happens when we are attached to something. If we are attached to something, we become absorbed in it even if we don't want to. Hasn't this happened to all of us? Right? So maybe some of you here, maybe you're sitting in the class, but if there's something that's bothering you, you may be thinking of that. Right? The other day, somebody had told me something that was very upsetting. And after that, I had a plane journey. I mean, I went to the airport. I was sitting on a plane. I got off the plane. I got out of the airport. And I didn't actually remember that I had traveled that day. It's like, did I travel today? Because I was so absorbed in what a person had told me that was upsetting that I really didn't interact with my surroundings very much. And so don't we have this experience? If there's, or someone if you're in love, when we fall in love with somebody, the rest of the world sort of disappears. And we may go through our day and so forth, but our consciousness is absorbed in the person we love. And that's true. Any of you who are parents, especially when you have a newborn baby, you're just completely absorbed in that child. Right? So you may wake up in the middle of the night, just not because they're crying, but just to check on them. Are they okay? Are they okay? Are they breathing? Are they breathing? Your baby falls asleep, and you put the baby down, and you go to do something in the other part of the house, but you're going checking on them, and you have a baby monitor or something. Are they okay? Are they okay? Are they okay? So this is a natural attachment of love. And it happens, again, if we're in anxiety about something or we're very attached to someone. So this is a kind of full samadhi where Shunyayitam Jagat Sarvam Govinda Virahiname. Nothing else in the world really seems particularly engaging other than our object of attachment. So this is the process, to become so attached to Krishna that everything we're doing is in this sort of very natural, loving samadhi. It's not the mechanical samadhi of Ashtanga yoga. It's a very natural, loving samadhi that we all know how to do. We've all done it. Yes, everybody has done this?
Yeah.
Had your mind so into something that it just was taking everything. So we do that for Krishna. Now, in Bhagavad Gita 12.5, which is particularly where Krishna discusses klesho, the difficulty, the other path, this path of bhakti from the beginning is very easy and natural. And Prabhupada gives the example that anybody can worship the deity with their material senses. If we're going to make Krishna the center of everything, Having a deity of Krishna makes it extremely easy and natural if all we can see are material things. I really like this commentary of Baladeva Vijabhushan, where he says, even though the devotees endure difficulty in withdrawing the senses from objects other than Krishna and engaging in the various angas of bhakti, they do not experience the same suffering as the impersonalists because of the dazzling attraction of Krishna's blissful form. And I think we can all attest to this, that there is difficulty on the path of bhakti. It's not always easy. Sometimes, our senses are still attracted to other things, and we have to make a deliberate attempt to think of Krishna. But at the same time, thinking of Krishna is very sweet. We may have to make an attempt to think of him, but as soon as we think of him, there's immediate sweetness. It's very pleasurable to think about Krishna. If what I'm thinking about, if what I'm absorbed in is that I have to fill out my tax returns, that may not be very pleasant, and I may not want to withdraw my mind from other things. We all have tasks we put off like that, isn't it? Things we know, okay, I've got to give this my attention, but it's not like that with Krishna. You don't think, oh my God, I got to think about Krishna. How awful. It just is not like that. As soon as we turn our attention to Krishna, even a little bit, Prabhupada says even to a minute degree, immediately we feel happy. Do you all have this experience?
Yep.
It just a little bit, like Krishna says, Majjata Magata Pranam Bodhayantas Prasvam Kathayantas Tumam Nityam Tushanti Charavanti Cha. That you just start talking about Krishna a little bit. And immediately like, whoa, that's so nice. Right? How Krishna's playing his flute, his peacock feather, and he's dancing. And immediately we're like, yeah. So there is some difficulty. My mind is going to go to, oh my goodness, I got to repair the vehicle, and my mother's not feeling well, and oh my goodness, it's my niece's birthday, and I got to give her a call, and did I make the payments on the car, and did I do it on time? So our mind's going to all these things, and so there's some difficulty with, how can I keep Krishna there all the time? So also the nature of this path is no previous qualification is needed. And Prabhupada says, pure devotional service is so powerful, however, that one may at once take to it without acquiring the previous qualifications of Brahmabhuta life. A sincere devotee who engages in the service of the Lord automatically becomes situated in the Brahmabhuta stage. Because this is the essence of Arjuna's question. Arjuna's question is, do I first become Brahmabhuta and then take up bhakti? Or can I just take up bhakti? And Prabhupada is saying here, you don't need to already be liberated before you can just think of Krishna. And this again is a misunderstanding we find very frequently. That if you say to people, just think of Krishna, well, can I do that? Am I allowed to just think of Krishna? I'm not liberated yet. If I think of Krishna, I'll not think of him properly, and so forth and so on. But here Prabhupada's being very clear that you can immediately start thinking of Krishna and doing things for Krishna and going to the market in full samadhi, even if you're not yet liberated, even if you're still conditioned. You don't have to have any qualifications. We don't even have to be a pious person. Who took up Krishna consciousness immediately without being a pious person? Yeah. You. I mean in the scriptures.
Was it Narada Muni?
Narada Muni is interesting. Yeah, of course he was a young child. But yes, he didn't undergo any kind of reformatory, anything. He hadn't even gone to school. He just, thank you, I like that he just took up bhakti. Some other example.
Prahlad Maharaj?
Prahlad Maharaj. Some other example.
Can you say Jagai Madai?
Jagai and Madai, definitely. Magrari the hunter, Valmiki, her name isn't given, but the prostitute who tried to make Haridas fall down. So there's a lot of examples in the scriptures, and of course in contemporary life too. Not you, I'm sure, but in contemporary life also, of people who go right from a sinful life or a non-purified life directly to bhakti, without anything in the middle. You know, it's like if you went from a 3-year-old and you can enter the PhD program immediately. You know, you don't have to go through all the steps. And how do we get delivered in bhakti? So the Lord himself, Prabhupada says, takes him. The devotee does not need to wait to become very experienced in order to transfer himself to the spiritual star. Well, that's nice, isn't it? We're depending on the mercy of the Lord. That even if the devotee hasn't attained transcendent Gyan, or has not properly done all aspects of dharmic karma, Krishna personally delivers the devotee. Now this is wonderful in 2019 particularly. Because how many of us can say, well, I have properly done all aspects of my dharmic karma? Anybody prepared to say that? I'm sure there's some people who've really, led a perfectly pure life and always done all of their duties properly according to Scripture. But I think the number of people who can honestly say that in 2019 is fairly small. Would you all agree?
Yes.
And we have a growing number of people in society who don't really fit into any ashram or any varna. They don't even have very clear duties. I was once visiting a temple where this one gentleman, like 38 years old, was in a lot of distress because the temple president wouldn't recommend him for initiation. And the reason for that, he was 38, he was divorced, and he had his own flat, and he had a job. He was his parents' only son, he was from India, and he was sending money to his parents every month, so he wanted to work. And the temple president said, but you're not properly situated in any ashram, so I can't recommend you for initiation. Said either you should give up your job and give up the flat and move into the temple and be a brahmachari, or you should marry again. And so this gentleman was speaking to me, and he said, I'm not going to go to a woman and say, can you marry me so I can be properly situated in the Grahastha ashram and get initiated? He said, this is ridiculous. So there's so many people in situations that we can't put into some category. When I first read Bhagavad Gita when I was 17 in university, whenever Prabhupada would use the word prescribed duties, I had no idea what he was talking about. Prescribed by whom? For what? I just never had encountered that term or even that concept growing up in America. Prescribed duties? Huh? It was there in a sense that I was brought up with the idea that when you go to school, you're supposed to go to class on time and do your work, and you're supposed to respect your parents. But I hadn't thought of those as prescribed duties. So I think we have a situation in most of the world where people really don't have kind of the qualifications that was much more prevalent thousands of years ago. And Prabhupada says it doesn't matter, even if you haven't done all of your dharmic karma. It's just irrelevant. And if you haven't realized Brahman, it's also irrelevant. Krishna just takes you. So in the Varaha Purana, Krishna says, according to my desire, unchecked, I bring them to my Dhamma, putting them on the shoulders of Garuda without going via the path of light. So the path of light is described in what chapter of the Gita? Anybody know? It's in the 8th chapter. It's the same chapter where Krishna says, Yam Yam Bhapi Svam Bhaman, whatever you think about at the time of death is what you achieve. And there Krishna says, if you die in such and such circumstance, at this time of year, at this time of day, and so forth, you go on the path of light and you become liberated. And if you die at this time, and you go to a heavenly planet and you come back. And I've often thought that explanation probably accounts for why people who have, some of the people who have near-death experiences have some sort of a Brahman experience. Perhaps you've read some of those? People who have near-death experiences and they have this amazing Brahman experience. And we might think, how did they get that? You know, how did that happen? But it is explained in the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita that dying at certain times takes you to certain places. But here Krishna is saying that that's not relevant for the devotees. That for the devotees, he just takes them home regardless of what time it is and what the circumstances are. It's just not relevant. It's just making me think about one of my sisters and I were very close when I was young, although she was 16 years older than me. And she always said, anytime you want to visit me, you can visit me. And I guess what she really meant was, if there's an emergency and you're in trouble, you can come by at any time. But I didn't really understand that. I just sort of took it very literally. And she lived in New York City. At that time, my parents were living in a nearby state in New Jersey. And I was out and about in the city in the middle of the night. And I said to my friends that I was with, hey, my sister said I can come by any time. Let's go. It was like 1 a.m. She wasn't exactly very happy. But, you know, if there's love, you really don't mind if somebody comes at 1 a.m. You know, especially if it's someone you haven't seen for a long time and you're missing them, even if they come at 1 a.m. You're like, yes, you're welcome, you're welcome. So Krishna he's not concerned with the particular time and circumstances, but he says he comes and puts them on the shoulder of Garuda and sticks us on the shoulder of Garuda, and we get to ride with him. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah? Right? When I was 16, I had my cousin's fiance gave me a ride on his motorcycle, which when I was 16, I was really thrilled about that. I was like, whoa, I get to ride on a motorcycle. Now I get to ride on the backs of motorcycles in India, but I'm never really thrilled about that. It's sort of like, okay, am I going to reach my destination in one piece or what? But imagine, you know, riding with Krishna on Garuda. Wouldn't that be fun? Ride on this giant eagle, go through all the universe, say hi to all the planets. Whoa. There's Indra's planet, there's Brahma's planet, all the different planets, and go through the coverings of the universe, all on the back of Garuda. So, that is the direct path of bhakti. What do you think? Sound good?
Yeah.
All right, now let's look at the other path. This is what Arjuna's question is. Can I do bhakti from the beginning, or do I have to go to bhakti by a gradual process? So, Krishna describes the goal of this gradual process in text 4. He says, at last they achieve me. So, what does this me mean? Because we have Brahmeti, Brahmeti, Paramatmeti, Bhagavaniti, Sabjite. There's different forms of the Lord, and even Bhagavan, there's Vishnu, there's Krishna, there's Ram, there's Raha, and what do you mean by me? So Baladev Vijabhushan says what Krishna means by me for this other path is a form predominated by extreme majesty. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says by me, Krishna means the impersonal Brahman, and Srila Prabhupada says by me, Krishna means Sri Krishna or Vasudeva, the son of Vasudeva. So what about the immediate goal? So the long-term goal is that on this other path, one will at last achieve whatever Krishna means by me. But intermediate, Arjuna asked this question, right? If you look at the very first question that Arjuna asked, go back to that question. If you look in your Bhagavad Gita. So if we look at the Sanskrit for text 1, so he's saying Aksharam, beyond the senses, the Avyaktam, the unmanifested. So what is he speaking about? So it's possible that he's speaking about the self, and it's possible that he's speaking about Krishna as Brahman. It's not that clear. What is he talking? The unmanifested, beyond the senses, the unknown. So Baladev Vijabhushana and Ramanujacharya both say that Arjuna here is referring to the self, the jiva, the atma. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and Srila Prabhupada say that Arjuna is talking about realizing Brahman. So that Arjuna is giving this as an intermediate goal. Should we first realize the self, or should we first realize Brahman and then go to bhakti, or should we just start with bhakti? Or you could say it means both, and Prabhupada in his purport to verses 3 to 4 says, perceive the super soul within the individual soul. So, doesn't really matter in one sense. If you say, do I have to realize the self first? We can't really realize the self without realizing something of God, because the self is a part of God. And if I realize God, I will also realize the self. Like Prabhupada says, when the sun comes up, you also see yourself. So in one sense, it doesn't really matter whether Arjuna was saying, before I do bhakti, do I have to realize myself, that I'm a soul? Before I do bhakti, do I have to realize your form is Brahman? Or was he saying, before I do bhakti, do I have to realize both myself and Brahman? So it doesn't really matter how we interpret Arjuna's question, because if you realize the self, you'll realize Brahman. If you realize Brahman, you realize the self. And again, what was the description here? Aksharam, beyond the senses, and avyaktam, the unmanifested. So what Arjuna is basically asking here is, do I need to be liberated first before I can think of Krishna? And again, I find this question is asked all the time in ISKCON. Many times when I give classes about chanting japa, and I present Srila Prabhupada's quotes about how to chant japa with attention, devotees are surprised. Because Srila Prabhupada says things in the 1960s, he says things like, if you're chanting Hare Krishna and thinking of mundane things, it is all useless. Then he pauses, he says, or it will take a long time. He said, then your chanting is deficient, it is not attentive. As soon as you chant Hare Krishna, you should remember Krishna's name and qualities and pastimes. Said you chant and you remember how Krishna is killing a demon and the cowherd boys are encouraging him with claps. Or you remember Krishna's instructions in the Bhagavad Gita. He said, why else are you reading Krishna book? Or Prabhupada said in Geneva, he said, chanting Hare Krishna means you make a diamond throne in your heart. You see Krishna there, you bathe him with Ganga and Yamuna water, you dress him with costly clothing and ornaments in your mind. Right? Or he'll say, as soon as you chant Hare Krishna, you remember the deity. Or Prabhupada sometimes will say, you see the deity, so that as soon as you chant Hare Krishna, you remember the deity. What is the difficulty? And many times I'll have devotees say, well, how can I think about Krishna when I'm chanting if I'm not liberated? Don't I need to become liberated first and then think of Krishna? So this is the essence of Arjuna's question. Do I need to have realized Aksharam and Avyaktam? Do I need to have sort of this general spiritual realization so that I realize that I'm a spirit soul and I realize God as Brahman, and then I can think of Krishna? So here, if we look at text 3 to 4, Krishna's answer in the goal is Aksharam, which is beyond the perception of the senses, Anirdeshyam, indefinite, Avyaktam, unmanifested, Sarvatragam, all-pervading, Achintyam, inconceivable, Kutastam, unchanging, Achalam, immovable, and Dhruvam, fixed. So here Krishna is responding to Arjuna's question about what is the reality, what is the truth that Arjuna is talking about realizing before starting bhakti. Now, you might ask, why does this even come up? Why is Arjuna asking this question? And why do so many contemporary devotees in ISKCON have the same question or the same difficulty or understanding. So one answer is that they might think, let me first remove all the obstacles to bhakti and then do bhakti. And some people, of course, who ask this question may not even have bhakti as their goal. So you have some people who have another goal. They have a goal of just liberation, or they have a goal of just general self-realization when they're starting out their spiritual processes. Yes, we meet many people like that. That is their goal. And it could even be that some people in ISKCON, while externally saying that they have a goal of loving service for the Lord, that actually their goal is some sort of liberated or enlightened state rather than pure love. So that it could be internally that's their goal, or it could be some stated goal. But here they're thinking, well, as Baldev Vijabhushan says, if this is something like, you say, well, before I start my work, I'm going to clean my desk. Yeah? Right? Well, it's very interesting for me. I was introduced for the first time to the concept of procrastinating. Actually, one of my friends introduced me to this, talking about procrastinating. Evidently, there are some people who they procrastinate when they don't want to do whatever needs to be done. They think, let me make a cherry pie. I haven't made a cherry pie for some time. And it's really just a way of putting off something else that they have to do. In this procrastinate laundry, I definitely do that. I think, okay, let me wash all the sheets and towels, and, I've definitely done procrastinating and procrastinate laundry. So it can sometimes be like that. I mean, there is some value to saying, let me clear off my desk before I do my work. But sometimes it's really just something else, right? It's just some sort of a distraction. But one may think like this. Let me first clear my mind. Yes, and even Srila Prabhupada, he says self-realization, the Brahmabhuta stage, is symptomized by joyfulness. One never laments for any loss, nor is one very enthusiastic when there is some gain. One sees everyone on equal level through spiritual understanding. These qualities are preliminary to entering into pure devotional service. So there are quotes like this from Prabhupada, from our acharyas, and these quotes may bring us to a misunderstanding that I have to attain Brahmabhuta through a process other than bhakti and then take up bhakti. Is this clear to everybody? Because if I'm saying I can't think of Krishna until I'm liberated, bhakti means, what's the process of bhakti? We already talked about the process of bhakti is to... Yes? We talked about the process of bhakti?
Always.
We did. What was our process? Remember this? Mind fixed on Shama Sundar, with faith transcendental, always engaged in the worship. Whatever we do for Krishna. We talked about samadhi. Everybody remembers that? Okay. That's the process of bhakti. So a person may think, well, before I can do that process of bhakti, I first have to be liberated. And they may even use a quote like this and say, well, Prabhupada says, first I have to be liberated before I can enter into pure devotional service. But if someone says that, what they're implying is they have to be liberated through something other than bhakti. Does everybody follow the logic of this? You follow the logic? The process of bhakti is primarily to... Don't let me fail as a teacher. I'll cry. The process of bhakti is mostly, what do we do in the process of bhakti? Worship, serve, and primarily think of Krishna. Yes, it's primarily a mental cultivation. So the process of bhakti is primarily thinking of Krishna. But we already read that might be a little hard. Didn't we read that quote? Maybe a little hard, you have to withdraw your mind from other things. So you might think, well, if I clear all these other things out first, then I can think of Krishna. But what will be the process of clearing out those other things. If it's not thinking about Krishna, if we're not using Krishna as the process, thinking about Krishna as the process to clear out those other things, we're using another process to clear out those other things. Are you all following this logical progression? So then we're doing something that's not bhakti to prepare us for bhakti. This is the essence of Arjuna's question. Should I do something that is not bhakti to prepare myself for bhakti? And again, reading these quotes, we may think we're supposed to do that. I can't do pure devotional service until I'm on Brahmabhuta, so I got to get to Brahmabhuta first. And if I can't do pure devotional service till I'm Brahmabhuta, I have to get to Brahmabhuta by doing something that's not pure devotional service. Yeah? So what would be that other something? So in text 3 to 4, Krishna talks about this. It would involve worship, upasate, control of the senses, seeing everyone equally, no duality between the self and others, and working for the welfare of all living entities. I really want to emphasize that this seeing others equally and working for the welfare of all, being neutral to friends and enemies, is absolutely essential on any spiritual path. One cannot have a mood of friends and enemies and being unkind to others and make progress. I don't care what you call your religion or what you call your spirituality or what you call anything. It doesn't matter. This is just basic. The concept that I can hate people who aren't like me, whether they're in a different religion or a different branch of my religion, or they have a different amount of melanin in their skin, or they speak a different language, or something, that I can hate others, that I can see that they're not a living being. It doesn't mean I have to approve of everything everybody does. You know, we don't approve of rape and murder and arson, but that doesn't mean that we hate the rapists and the murderer and the arsonists. What to speak of somebody who just has a different opinion? You know? Like if we're not supposed to hate rapists, murderers, and arsonists, you know, and then we're, as you're all very familiar with in this part of the world, you know, we don't get out our shotguns and kill people because they're a different branch of our own religion. Yeah? That's not spirituality. You worship Mary. You don't worship Mary. Bang, bang, bang. Hello? So this is just such a preliminary thing. And if we're not doing this, we're not on a spiritual path. It just, we really haven't even started. If we're not even doing our best to go in this direction, to be above friends and enemies, and to see that other living beings, all other living beings, not even just humans, but all other living beings have feelings and desires, just like me. You know, everyone I pass on the street, all the animals, all the plants, they all have feelings and desires just like me. Sorry for that one.
No, that one's fine.
That
Yeah.
one's fine, okay. But the nature of this path, this second path, other than bhakti, is it's troublesome. Klesho dikartarashtesham, avyaktasha chetasam, avyaktyahi gatirduha, dehavadvir avapite. Krishna says it's very troublesome. Full of klesha. It's very difficult. It's very theoretical at first. I'm not the body, everything's spiritual. And even if you succeed, one only realize is the platform of eternality and knowledge, but not the blissful portion. Right? We're not realizing the complete, absolute truth. Yeah? So it's difficult. Vishwanath Chakravarti says, Thakur says, how can one perceive the unmanifest through the senses? So one has to stop the senses, but that is like stopping a river. Or as Arjuna had said earlier in the Bhagavad Gita, it's like stopping the wind. See, what happens is, like we were talking about Astanga Yoga Samadhi where a person first goes into pratyahara. Pratyahara means you stop the senses. You stop seeing, you stop hearing, you stop smelling, you stop tasting, like we do in deep sleep, where all of our senses stop. But that's very difficult, to stop the senses and not go into deep sleep. In fact, Prabhupada talks about people who try to meditate and they just fall asleep. So to stop the senses and to make the mind and relaxed, it's very difficult. So to have the mind completely still. Now Krishna says, as soon as one's conquered the mind, the super soul is automatically reached. And he says happiness in the mode of goodness awakens one to self-realization. So it is a fact that if you stop the mind and the senses, one will realize the self. But how does one do that? It's like stopping a river. It's like stopping the wind. So it's extreme. It can be extremely difficult. We're talking about doing this in bhakti. We already talked about thinking of Krishna in bhakti. How do we think of Krishna in bhakti? Yeah. By chanting, singing. But it's very natural. We think of Krishna in bhakti the same way we think about our child, or our beloved, or our new car. It's exactly the same way that we think about those things. We think about Krishna, and when we think about Krishna, the other activities of the mind naturally slow down and eventually stop. Whereas on this other path, you simply have to stop the mind without engaging it in something higher, so it's extremely difficult. Also, it's very interesting that this path needs some worship. So there has to, and Prabhupada makes this point all the time, you have to mix a little bhakti into this path. So it's not really an absolute choice between bhakti and not bhakti, because even the not bhakti path has to have some worship. There has to be some bhakti. Otherwise, Vishnu Chakravarti says, you're just going through trouble. If you try to take this other path without any bhakti in it at all, it's simply trouble. And in fact, we see this, that the people who are going for the impersonal realization and the voidist meditation, they end up having trouble. Once they achieve it, generally, they come back to worldliness. Generally. So I was mentioning this at Govindadweep at Indushrad. It was a very, very famous story of one Indian woman in Singapore who had a near-death experience after dying from stage 4 cancer, where the cancer had spread throughout her body, all of her organs had shut down. And she had been, it was Indian extraction, and she had been a follower of impersonalistic and Buddhist ideas. And she explains that after she died, that she had this impersonal experience. And she described this experience, how it was, so peaceful, and she knew everything. So it must have been some aspect of Paramatma. She was saying she just knew everything. And she said if she thought about any other person, she felt that she would become them. She felt this oneness between herself and everyone, that she could just understand anyone by becoming them. But she decided that she didn't want to stay in that state eternally. She decided she wanted to go back to her body. And her reason was that she wanted, she said, an illusion of separateness so that she could enjoy relationships. So she decided that the ultimate reality was oneness, but she didn't want the oneness. And she wrote a book. I ended up reading parts of it at one devotee's house in Bahrain. And anyway, she mostly became very famous because when she returned to her body almost instantly healed. So within like 4 or 5 days, there was no trace of the cancer anywhere in her body. And because she died in a hospital, her case was very thoroughly researched and documented. And so that's the main reason that her case, people were, interestingly enough, people were much more interested in the fact that her bodily diseases had healed than they were interested in her spiritual realizations. So that was a little side note. But I thought it fascinating that this is what she said. She said, I attained this state of oneness where I felt like I was everyone and everyone was me, but I didn't like it. I wanted a sense of individual identity so I could have relationships, and I prefer to come back to this world and come in a body, in a material body, so I could experience relationships. Yeah. So therefore, that we're hearing all the time that you don't get the blissful portion. Right? We're not getting the blissful portion. This particular kind of realization, yes, it gets you knowledge. Yes, it gets you a feeling of eternity. Yes, there's a feeling of relief. Just like when you take a vacation and you go to the sea. And you at the beach, everyone's looking at the sea. You notice that? They're just staring at the sea. There's a very famous poem, I can't remember the author, about this, how that we're just staring at the ocean, even though we can't see deep. Right? It all looks basically the same, just the waves all the time. Now, we're not going to stare at the ocean forever. It's a kind of relief. I'll just look at the ocean. After a while, you want to do something else, yes? Nobody just sits at the beach for their whole life, just staring at the ocean. So the problem with these other paths, they're very difficult to achieve. And then what you get is not fully satisfying. And there's a big risk of falling back to material relationships. Like this woman, she didn't go from that realization to Bhagavan. Being from India, she knew something about Krishna. But she didn't go from there to a personal relationship with the Lord. And there's also a danger of turning to atheism. Now, why is there a danger of turning to atheism? It's very interesting. As our godbrother Sariputta did this book called Alien Identities. Some of you may be familiar. I saw a copy at Govinda Dream, where he was looking at the empirical evidence for contact between human beings and entities from other planets. And then he was comparing that to the evidence given in the scripture for interchange between humans and beings from other planets, higher or lower. And one of the things that he said surprised him was that when humans encountered entities from lower realms, those entities were preaching impersonalism. And his conclusion was that impersonalism is the religion of the demons. And I thought that's really fascinating. It's the destination of the demons that Krishna kills, but it's also a spiritual path and a spiritual philosophy that's put forward by those who are against the personality of Godhead. So there's a danger when one gets into some sort of impersonal path of becoming very materialistic. And in fact, we see that in many modern spiritual or so-called spiritual movements, where they talk about, just being with the light and the universe. Why? To get that red sports car. Yeah? They're trying to get some mystic power of connection with the ultimate so that they can be a materialist. You all familiar with this? Yes? Red sports car. Red sports car. I put it on my vision board. I meditate on a red sports car in my driveway. They become a materialist. That they're going to try to control the universe. I mean, it's a fact that it's a mystic power that you can just prakti siddhi, you can grab something from somewhere else, or you can just manifest things. That is a mystic power. But their interest in this mystic power is there because they want to be the lords of the universe. So they're preaching this impersonalistic philosophy. But they become materialists. They become, in many cases, atheists. Also, this path needs prior qualification. Prabhupada writes in Enunciation Through Wisdom, those who've been able to eradicate their sins by living according to the dictates of their social and spiritual order, that means Varna and Ashram, and who have thus acquired sufficient piety, are qualified to practice karma yoga. Gradually they progress to Gyan Yoga, and finally in meditation they realize the transcendental and supreme position of the Lord. Now this is very logical. I can't do karma yoga unless I can do karma. How do I do my prescribed duties for Krishna if I can't do my prescribed duties at all? Or if I don't have any prescribed duties? What were the prescribed duties from Agrari or the prostitute? They didn't have any kind of prescribed duties. So talking about doing their prescribed duties for Krishna doesn't really make sense for someone like that. And also, there's reasons why one would have to have a background of piety. Because again, you're trying to control the mind, not by thinking of Krishna, but by just trying to make the mind still. So unless one's already operating to a large extent in sattva gun, that's just not going to be possible. Somebody who's operating to a large extent in tamagun and rajagun, they're just not going to be able to make the mind still. It's going to be very frustrating for them. So there needs to be some background in material piety. Now then you might wonder, what's the bridge to bhakti? How would one get from this other path to bhakti? Because this is what Arjuna is asking, should I do this other path first? And here Prabhupada writes, after attaining impersonal perfection by the grace of some devotee, such a transcendentalist, highly learned in the process of Jnana Yoga, may come to, and this would apply to the other ones as well, to Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga, may come to the point of Bhakti Yoga or devotional service. At that time, long practice in impersonalism also becomes a source of trouble because he cannot give up the idea. Therefore, an embodied soul is always in difficulty with the unmanifest, both at the time of practice and at the time of realization. So the way that one goes from perfection in this other path and then starts bhakti is one has to have the mercy of a devotee. That is the bridge. But Prabhupada is saying, even with the mercy of a devotee, it may be very difficult. I always like to tell the story of my nephew, who was raised as an Orthodox Jew. So he was going to this, basically a brahmachari ashram, and studying the scriptures and so forth. And there was all men, all the teachers were men, all the students were men. And they didn't see women, they didn't talk to women, and so forth. And then he got to a point where he wanted to get married. So he went to his teacher and he said, I would like to marry. And his teacher said, for so many years, you have not looked at any women. But if I arrange to introduce you to a suitable girl, you have to look at her. So it may be difficult. I mean, I spent, I think it was about 10 months living in one temple in ISKCON in the 1970s that had very, very extreme and draconian rules about the relationship between men and women. So we were not allowed to wear any bright colored saris, even though devotees in Mayapur were making they were making their own saris by hand. So we get these saris made by the devotees in Mayapur that were like hot pink color, but we weren't allowed to wear them in this temple. And you know, we were supposed to put our saris over our head like this, you know, so you had to kind of do this if you wanted to see anything. And I remember making the point, I said, well, married women are supposed to put cinder in their hair. What's the use of having cinder in your hair to tell everyone you're married if nobody can see the part in your hair? So I was rebellious. Is it obvious that I'm rebellious? Anyways, I was rebellious, and so I would wear my sari myself and one of my god sisters, Madame Mahan Mohini, who we call affectionately 3M2D. We would both wear our saris like this. And then they had these rules. The temple had, just like kind of this temple that has the stairway, all these flights. So there were 4 flights of stairs, but the stairway was very narrow. And so they had a rule that if a woman was walking up or down the stairs and a man was walking, the woman had to get out of the way. And she had to get out of the way by going either all the way back up to the top or all the way back down to the bottom. You know, so that was one rule. Another rule was if a man was passing by, you had to immediately throw your face into the wall or into a corner with your sari like this. So, you know, it just looked like a piece of cloth there. I mean, it was so extreme. One time I was waiting to go up the stairs and there was a brahmachari sitting at the bottom of the stairs. And so I immediately put my face in the corner and I just stood there waiting for this brahmachari to notice that I had my face in the corner and for him to move. And after 20 minutes, I decided that I was going to risk taking a look, and it was a saffron-colored garbage bag. So, and they had a rule, because Prabhupada had made a statement in one lecture that the beauty of a married woman is that she never speaks to any man other than her husband. Now, first of all, Srila Prabhupada, no way could have meant that as an absolute literal statement. Could you imagine if you couldn't talk to your son? You know, it's absurd, or your father or your brother, so it couldn't have been no man other than her husband. Anyway, the temple president, in his infinite wisdom, decided that the married women should not speak to any man, but we were allowed to write notes. Just think about that one for a minute. So somehow it was more proper to like pass this, furtive note. And he let the unmarried women talk to the men. So, it was a very. Anyway, I lived in this situation for 10 months, and yeah, I did indeed. I mean, there was one time it was so extreme. There was a woman cooking in the kitchen, a married woman, and there was a brahmachari out in the car park outside the temple, and a fire started in one of the car engines, and there was a water hose, but the knob for the water hose was inside the kitchen. So he's trying to get this woman in the kitchen to turn on the water, and she just wouldn't look at him. He's banging. Hey, there's a fire out here. Can't look at him then. And we had a situation where we would just always look at the floor. Anyway, when we left that temple, we moved to another temple. And after we were in that other temple for about a week, my husband came to me and said, Urmila, the brahmacharis in this temple are all complaining about you. I said, why? They said, because if ever they have to talk to you, you're just looking at the floor or you're looking out the window. So after the 10 months of conditioning like that, I learned something in those 10 months. I learned quite a lot of things. But one of the primary things that I learned is that we can't imagine what another culture is like and put that imagination into our current culture, nor can you take an imagined piece from one culture and just transplant it into another culture and think that it's going to work. I really got a lesson in kind of holistic thinking and intelligent and practical thinking. But anyway, I had a problem after being conditioned like that for 10 months, that I had difficulty talking to any of the men in a normalist temple where they didn't have those sort of rules. So it's the same kind of thing that happens with this impersonal realization. If you get really, really, really good at stopping the mind and making the mind completely quiet and still, and then you're told to think of Krishna, that's hard. Does this make sense to everybody? So it's very hard to make the mind completely still without thinking of Krishna. If we think of Krishna, we can still the mind in terms of the modes of nature. What that basically means is that we notice the modes, but we don't grab them. It's not that the modes stop going through. Like if you read anything about impersonal meditation, they're not saying that the thoughts and feelings stop. They're just saying that you simply observe them and you don't have any attachment to them. Kind of like, so if you're driving down the road, you don't pay that much attention to the cars that go by you. You just make sure you don't hit them, but you're not, if you were to meditate on them, you would hit them. You're focused on where you're going. So in Krishna consciousness, we're focused on where we're going, and therefore we're detached from the cars going past. In impersonal realization, you're not focused on anything in particular, and you stop focusing on the cars that are going past. It's also interesting that in impersonal meditation, they often use some device to focus on. They often don't try to focus on nothing. Many times they'll try to focus on the breath. And what is the breath? Arjuna says in the 10th chapter, Krishna, you are air. And Krishna says, I join with the breath incoming and outgoing to digest the 4 kinds of foodstuffs. So they actually are meditating on Krishna. They're just not really aware of it. But anyway, if one becomes expert at this, if one becomes expert at letting all thoughts, feelings, and desires just go past one without holding on to any of them, and just keeping the mind still, perhaps on the breath, then if you say, okay, now engage the mind in thoughts, feelings, and desires about Krishna, it may be very, very difficult. It may be very, very difficult. Just like it was hard for me to talk to any of the men. Or just like it was hard for my nephew to talk to the woman he eventually married. Because you have this long-standing practice. So it's a difficult thing to achieve, and once you achieve it, it's difficult to make the next step. But the only way you can do that is by the grace of the devotee. Okay, we're going to take a break before we go on to do part 2, which is the next few verses. So, yeah?
It's just one question. It's slightly off topic, but still. And it's just that, you know, we see when Krishna comes down with Garuda and he's going to pull the devotee onto Garuda's shoulders. And it's like, we often hear that we can never get to the spiritual world unless we're completely clear of all material desires and all, you know. Is there a slight, or could you clear up the kind of slight contradiction there that you're going to go to the spiritual world the way I am and I've got so many material
Well, I think that question is very relevant because it's very similar to Arjuna's question that I can't even really start bhakti until I'm free from material desires. That Arjuna's asking, can I even start thinking of Krishna as long as I have any material identification? And yes, we are told, just like we're told, you can't really do pure devotional service with any material identification. But it's the devotional service itself that purifies us. Can we go to the spiritual world unless we're completely pure? Well, you know, there's an interim. It's nicely explained that before we go to Goloka, in the spiritual world, where do we go?
Heavenly planets?
Well, that's if you haven't made much progress at all. Where do we go?
to another planet
Where what's happening?
where Krishna is performing pastimes.
Yes. So the first step is we enter into the planet, it could be this universe or another universe, where Krishna is performing his pastimes in the material world. Is everyone who is in Krishna's pastimes in that circumstance 100% pure?
Maybe not, no.
No. How do we know that? What's our evidence?
When the
Because
gopis.
they're not aware.
Yeah, some of the gopis, they don't immediately go to the Ras dance, right? Some of the gopis were prevented by their family members from going, and it said the reason for that is they still had some remaining contamination. And so in that mood of separation, that was burnt out. And it's very interesting, in Ujjwala Nilamani, Rupa Goswami talks about how some of the queens who were married to the Purus and the Kurus, when they saw Krishna, they thought, I'd like to marry him. But they couldn't do that then. So they were there in Krishna's pastimes on this planet, but some of them weren't even situated in their citadel, or the wives of the Brahmanas. Many of them wanted to become gopis. So they interacted with Krishna personally. They became free of all material contamination in that situation. So we have many instances when Krishna brings his pastimes to the material world, that many of the people joining Krishna's pastimes there are at different levels of purification. Does that answer your question? Isn't that nice? Yes? Now the ideal thing is that when we leave our body, we've realized our swarup, we've realized our relationship with Krishna. And then when we enter into Krishna's pastimes in the material world, we enter directly into our swarup, and then we have the association of the eternally liberated souls who further train us, because there's not really training going on in the spiritual world. Is that all right?
Yeah.
And if we're far less than that, then yeah, we could go to the heavenly planets or take birth in a family of devotees or so forth. All right, why don't we take a 15-minute break till 12 o'clock?